Imagine a world where the powerful reign over the weak, where the voices of the oppressed are silenced, and where the only way to break free from the chains of injustice is to make an unimaginable sacrifice. This is the world of Lady Godiva, a woman whose name has echoed through the halls of history, not just because of her noble birth, but because of a single act that would define her legacy for centuries to come. But who was the real Lady Godiva? Was she simply a beautiful noblewoman who defied her husband, or was she something more, a symbol of bravery, a woman willing to expose herself in public to bring justice to the people she loved? In this journey, we delve into the life of Lady Godiva, from her noble birth in the 11th century to the moment that immortalized her in history and legend. Her tale is one of politics, power, love, and sacrifice. It is a story of a woman who used her position to stand against the oppressive rule of her husband, Leofric, and who became a figure of controversy, love, and legend. But behind the famous ride lies a far deeper story, one of struggle, defiance, and a desire to help those in need. Her courage to ride through the streets of Coventry, naked, in the hopes of securing a fairer tax for the townspeople, would make her a symbol of both revolutionary thinking and human compassion. Yet, as with many legends, the line between fact and myth blurs. Was Lady Godiva's ride a desperate plea for justice, or was it a calculated political move designed to shift the power dynamics of her time? Join us as we explore the tragic life of Lady Godiva, uncovering the real woman behind the legend, the politics of the age, and how her bold act reshaped the future, leaving an imprint on history that still fascinates the world to this day. If you're ready to dive deep into the life of one of the most iconic women in history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the incredible story of Lady Godiva. Let's begin. In the early 11th century, at the heart of Anglo-Saxon England, a world filled with the power struggles of nobles, monarchs, and invaders, there lived a woman whose name would echo through the ages, Lady Godiva. To many, she is a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and defiance, a woman who, centuries ago, made a choice so bold that it would become one of the most famous acts of rebellion in medieval history. But who was she, really? Why did her name transcend her time, becoming not just the subject of legend, but the symbol of a revolution of sorts, not of armies or swords, but of the heart? Lady Godiva was born into an era when the world was dominated by men. The Anglo-Saxon society of 11th century England was a brutal patriarchal world, where noble women were often relegated to roles of mere diplomacy, marriage, and family alliances. At the center of this society, there existed powerful figures like Leofric, Earl of Mercia, a man with lands, wealth, and influence. As the wife of Leofric, Lady Godiva was thrust into a life of privilege, but this privilege came with its own sets of burdens. Raised in the high courts of Saxon England, Godiva was not only a noblewoman, but a symbol of Saxon society's complex hierarchies. Her marriage to Leofric was no love story, it was a political alliance. Leofric, known for his strength and military prowess, was an integral part of the Saxon nobility, a vital player in a kingdom teetering on the edge of Norman control. But despite her high birth, Godiva had little say in the politics of her own life at the time. Marriage was her duty, and as she stepped into the role of wife to one of the most powerful men in the realm, she began to understand the immense power her position held, and yet how little power she herself had in her hands. The world around her was a constantly shifting battlefield, where allegiances were fragile, and power was a game played on the backs of the powerless. Her father's world was one of aristocratic norms, but hers was one that saw the collapse of Saxon dominance and the rise of a new power, the Normans, who were gradually claiming their place in England's history. For Lady Godiva, the early years of her life were marked by a sharp awareness of the intricacies of court politics. She learned quickly that power was not just wielded in the battlefields or courtrooms, it was also held in whispers, alliances, and the art of diplomacy. The halls of her home were filled with discussions about taxes, land, power, and influence. It was in these moments that she began to understand the true cost of leadership, of authority, and of being a woman in a world that did not often allow women to lead. As Godiva adjusted to life in Leofric's castle, she quickly became more than just a dutiful wife. She was a woman of remarkable beauty and intellect, admired not only for her appearance but also for her sharp mind. Yet, her beauty and grace also made her a target for whispers and envy among the courts. It was during these early years in her marriage that Godiva began to sense the deeper currents of power that flowed through the halls of her new home. Yet, for all her beauty and intellect, Godiva's life was not one of simple luxury. The political climate was volatile, and even the most powerful noble families were vulnerable to the shifting tides of loyalty and betrayal. Leofric, despite his powerful position, was not immune to the pressures of medieval politics. As Godiva settled into her new role, she began to witness the delicate dance of power that characterized the world she now inhabited. But beyond the intrigues of politics, Godiva's heart could not ignore the inequality she witnessed daily. Her position as a noblewoman placed her in a space of privilege, but it also highlighted the suffering of those outside her walls. She could not help but notice the glaring disparity between the lives of the peasants and the comfort enjoyed by those in the noble classes. The common people, bound by high taxes and suffering under Leofric's rule, were all but invisible to the elite. As Godiva moved through her daily life, seeing the stark contrast between wealth and poverty, a seed of empathy began to take root in her heart. Yet, even as her awareness of the injustices of her world grew, Godiva found herself bound by the very structures that sought to control her. She was the wife of a powerful man, but that power was his, not hers. Her role was to stand beside him, to support him, but never to challenge him. She had no authority of her own, no voice in the political decisions that shaped her life or the lives of those around her. She was confined to the domestic realm, a place where women of her station were expected to remain silent, even when their hearts cried out for justice. Despite these constraints, Godiva's intellect and keen sense of fairness could not be easily suppressed. She watched as the injustices of the world around her continued unabated. The peasants, forced to pay taxes they could not afford, were growing restless. They were suffering under the burden of a system that only seemed to benefit the wealthy. And Godiva, though confined to the role of wife, could not help but feel the stirrings of rebellion within her. How could she remain silent when so many were suffering? In these early years, the foundations of Godiva's legacy were being laid. She would not be content to remain passive, to sit idly by while the world around her crumbled. She would find a way to challenge the injustices that plagued her world, even if it meant stepping outside the confines of the role she had been given. The path ahead would be fraught with danger, but it was a path Godiva could not ignore. And in time, her journey would take her to a place where the eyes of all of England, and perhaps the world, would be upon her. Lady Godiva's life, though gilded by the wealth and status of her marriage to Leofric, was not without its internal conflict. As she settled into the complex world of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, she realized that her position as a wife to one of the most powerful men in Mercia didn't grant her the power she desired. Despite the privileges of nobility, her identity was inextricably tied to the man she married. The societal norms of the time dictated that a woman's power, if she had any, was only exercised through her husband or father, and Godiva was no exception. While her beauty and intellect were admired, these traits were seen as secondary to the role she was expected to play in supporting Leofric's position. As an aristocratic woman, she was expected to run the household and bear children, all the while maintaining the appearance of decorum and obedience. The scope of her influence was often limited to private matters, her voice not reaching far beyond the walls of their castle. Yet, as Godiva watched her husband navigate the volatile political landscape of the time, she began to recognize the influence that she, too, could wield not through direct command, but through her ability to subtly shape the world around her. Leofric, while powerful and respected, was not immune to the pressures of his position. The Norman conquest was looming, and Anglo-Saxon England was in a fragile state, with conflicting loyalties and rising tensions between the Saxon nobles and the incoming Normans. Leofric, ever the loyal servant of King Edward the Confessor, found himself caught between allegiances, his loyalty to the king and the emerging power of the Normans, and his duty to the Saxon people who were beginning to grow discontented with their rulers. It was in this moment of political uncertainty that Godiva realized the depth of the challenge she faced. While Leofric maneuvered behind the scenes, engaging in the politics of the day, she was left to ponder her own role in a world where women had little voice. It was also in these early years that Godiva began to observe the stark contrast between the lives of the nobility and the plight of the common people. From the vantage point of her noble home, she saw that the peasants, who worked the land and provided the wealth for the noble classes, were suffering. High taxes, forced labor, and oppressive laws placed enormous burdens on those with the least. The cries of the poor, drowned out by the noise of the noble courts, reached Godiva's ears, and her conscience could no longer remain quiet. She could not ignore the disparity between the wealth she and her husband enjoyed and the lives of those who lived in poverty under their rule. But what could she do? She had no direct power to change the laws, no ability to affect the tax structure, and certainly no political autonomy. Yet, despite these constraints, Godiva began to see how she might exert influence. Though women in her time were expected to remain in the background, supporting their husbands and maintaining their homes, Godiva's position as the wife of a powerful nobleman gave her a unique opportunity. She was no ordinary woman. Her beauty and grace may have been her most visible traits, but her intelligence and innate sense of justice set her apart from the typical noblewoman of her time. Her growing dissatisfaction with the way the world was arranged led her to become more vocal. She had witnessed the suffering of the peasants, and though she could not outright challenge the established order, she began to speak to her husband about the burdens the common people faced. Leofric, while a man of power, was also a man of practicality. He had to maintain control over his lands and his people, and the taxes he levied on the common folk were a way to secure his political and military standing. For Godiva, however, the suffering of the people weighed heavily on her conscience. She could not simply accept the status quo when it meant that innocent lives were being crushed beneath it. Her growing awareness of the injustices of her world, coupled with her desire to help those in need, eventually led her to a critical moment of reckoning. Though her position as a woman of the nobility was restrictive, she realized that she could use her influence to reach her husband. It was not through direct confrontation or rebellion, but through dialogue, persuasion, and a deep understanding of the political dynamics at play. She began to push for changes, to advocate for the common people whose voices had long been silenced. Yet even as she made her case to Leofric, she knew that her efforts could be in vain. The pressures of power, politics, and wealth were not easily swayed, even by someone as intelligent and compassionate as Lady Godiva. The struggle she faced was not just one of politics, it was one of personal conviction. How could she, as a woman, navigate a world where her voice was meant to be silent? How could she, as a wife, push for change without undermining the very authority her marriage was built upon? These questions weighed heavily on Godiva's heart. She had been raised in a society where her worth was tied to her husband's status, and yet she could not ignore the growing tension between her conscience and the political realities she faced. As the political landscape of England continued to shift, and as tensions between the Saxon nobility and the Norman forces increased, Godiva found herself in a precarious position. Her desire to help the common people was at odds with the political responsibilities of her husband, and the more she tried to intervene, the more she began to feel the weight of the role she had been born into. She could no longer simply observe the injustices of the world around her. She would have to act. The path ahead would not be easy. As much as Godiva desired change, she knew that her actions could have far-reaching consequences not just for her, but for her husband, her family, and the kingdom she lived in. But the fire of justice burned within her, and despite the constraints of her time, she was determined to do what she could to make a difference. It was in this moment of quiet defiance that the legend of Lady Godiva began to take shape. Lady Godiva's marriage to Leofric was not an emotional union, but a strategic and political one, designed to strengthen the power and influence of the Mercian aristocracy. In the early 11th century, marriage among the nobility was often dictated by political necessity, not personal affection. Godiva, a woman of noble birth, was expected to be a pawn in this grand game, cementing her family's political alliances through her marriage to Leofric, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. For Godiva, This marriage marked the beginning of a journey where power, duty, and morality would collide. Leofric, as the Earl of Mercia, was a man of considerable stature. His lands spanned vast stretches of England, and he held a commanding position within the Saxon nobility. His influence was not merely derived from his wealth and lands, but also from his strategic alliances, his military strength, and his ability to navigate the ever-changing political tides of the time. However, like many noblemen, Leofric was bound by the expectations of his social class and the duty to uphold the fragile power structures of the time. When Godiva married Leofric, she entered a world where her role was largely defined by her husband's ambitions. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and beauty, but her power in this new world was muted, shaped by the rigid gender roles that defined medieval England. In the world of the Anglo-Saxon elite, women were primarily seen as bearers of children and supporters of their husbands' political agendas. The notion of a woman wielding power in her own right was anathema to the structures of society. For Godiva, the first years of her marriage were spent navigating the complexities of court life and adjusting to the powerful, often oppressive world of Leofric's domain. She lived in the shadows of the political intrigue and warfare that defined her husband's life. She was acutely aware of the duties that fell to her as the wife of an earl, to maintain the household, to manage the estates, and, most importantly, to bear the children who would inherit Leofric's lands and titles. But as she became more attuned to the struggles of the people beneath her husband's rule, Godiva began to question the cost of this power. Life at the castle was marked by elaborate feasts, political meetings, and the constant hum of power struggles. Though Godiva had access to the court's most powerful figures, her role was defined by the expectations of her sex. Women of noble birth were often seen, but rarely heard. Their voices were not intended for matters of governance. They were to manage the domestic sphere, stay within the boundaries of their roles, and support their husbands in all things. Yet, for Godiva, this world felt increasingly suffocating. She could not help but observe the lives of the common people who lived in the shadow of the castle. The peasants who worked the land and provided the wealth for the nobility were, by contrast, often unseen and unheard. Taxes were high, and the labor they endured in the fields was grueling. Life for these common folk was a daily struggle for survival. While the nobles lived in luxury, this stark contrast between the lives of the rich and poor became ever more apparent to Godiva, and as she became more aware of the injustices that shaped the world around her, her empathy for the suffering of the people began to grow. Godiva's early observations of the disparities between the nobility and the commoners planted the seeds of conflict in her heart. She began to recognize the fragility of the system that kept the aristocracy in power. While the nobility relied on the labor of the peasants to sustain their wealth, the latter were subjected to an unjust system that perpetuated their suffering. The disparity between the two classes was glaring, and Godiva could not ignore it. Despite being part of the privileged class, Godiva's empathy led her to question the fairness of the political system in which she found herself. She watched as Leofric and other noblemen made decisions that directly affected the lives of the people. They raised taxes, demanded labor, and waged wars that drained the resources of the kingdom, all while living lives of opulence. Yet the people who bore the weight of these decisions were left to endure without reprieve. Godiva had a unique position within this world. As the wife of a powerful earl, she could use her influence to speak on behalf of the suffering people. Even though her role was often one of quiet compliance, she began to understand that her voice, though not loudly proclaimed, could carry weight if used strategically. But speaking out was not without its risks. In a society where women had little to no political power, to challenge the status quo was a dangerous act, particularly for a woman of her rank. Though her influence was limited, Godiva began to subtly express her concerns to Leofric. She used the private moments they shared to advocate for those suffering under the burdens of the nobility's decisions. She argued that the common people deserved more compassion, more fair treatment, and relief from the crushing taxes that kept them in poverty. Yet, despite her best efforts, Leofric remained resolute in his decisions. His loyalty to the crown, to maintaining his power and wealth, was unyielding. Godiva's frustration grew as she realized that Leofric, despite his outward affection for her, was more focused on his political ambitions than on the welfare of the common folk. Her growing sense of moral responsibility clashed with Leofric's political pragmatism. She could no longer ignore the reality of the system they upheld. Her heart told her to act, to speak out, to take a stand for those who had no voice, but her position as the wife of one of the most powerful men in the kingdom held her back. As time passed, Godiva's internal struggle intensified. She could no longer ignore the growing injustice she saw every day. But her sense of duty to her husband, to the role she had been born into, kept her tethered to the system. The political landscape of Mercia, and of all of England, was shifting, and she could sense that change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. As the years went by, Godiva's dissatisfaction with the political situation in Mercia deepened. Though she was a woman of great beauty and intellect, her role as the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, confined her to a secondary position in the court's complex political games. She was expected to support Leofric, manage his estates, and bear children to ensure the future of their house. However, this was not enough for Godiva. Her growing awareness of the inequality that permeated the lives of the common people in Mercia gnawed at her, challenging her sense of justice and purpose. The people of Mercia were struggling under Leofric's rule. Taxes were high, and the common folk were burdened by the demands of their landowners. As the wife of one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the kingdom, Godiva was living in a world of luxury, while those who toiled in the fields were living in abject poverty. This stark contrast between the lives of the elite and the suffering of the poor weighed heavily on Godiva. As she walked through the streets of Mercia, the faces of the poor and downtrodden haunted her. She saw children in rags and families who could barely afford to feed themselves, while her husband and his fellow lords enjoyed sumptuous feasts and lives of opulence. The disparity between the nobility and the common people became increasingly apparent to her. Leofric, despite his noble intentions and loyalty to King Edward the Confessor, seemed largely unconcerned with the welfare of the commoners. The peasants were merely tools for maintaining the wealth and status of the nobility. They were taxed mercilessly, forced into labor, and treated with disdain by those who lived above them. The more Godiva witnessed this, the more she realized that her conscience could no longer remain silent. Her position as Leofric's wife, while advantageous in many ways, became a source of inner conflict. Though she had influence in some areas, particularly in the management of her household and estates, Godiva knew that her voice carried little weight when it came to the matters of politics and governance. She had no official say in the laws of the land or the taxes that burdened the poor. The laws of medieval England were structured in such a way that power was firmly in the hands of men, and women like Godiva were meant to support their husbands, not challenge them. Yet, despite these limitations, Godiva's heart could not turn away from the injustice she saw around her. She began to engage in private conversations with Leofric, discussing the plight of the common people and the growing unrest in the kingdom. She gently urged him to consider the suffering of the peasants and the unfairness of the taxes they were forced to pay. She spoke of compassion, of fairness, and of justice, but Leofric remained unmoved. His loyalty to the crown and his desire to maintain his power were stronger than any personal feelings of empathy. The reality of governance, he believed, required harsh measures to ensure the survival of the kingdom. Leofric's refusal to act on Godiva's pleas marked a turning point in their marriage. Godiva began to realize that her moral convictions were in direct conflict with the political system her husband upheld. She had entered this marriage expecting a partnership, but as the years passed, she saw that Leofric was more focused on maintaining his wealth and influence than on addressing the needs of the people. His political calculations, though grounded in loyalty and the desire for stability, were disconnected from the lives of those who were suffering under his rule. Godiva, once a passive observer of her husband's politics, could no longer stay silent. The voices of the poor, whom she had witnessed struggling in the fields and markets, rang in her ears. She had begun to see the true cost of Leofric's power, and it was one that left countless lives in ruin. As much as she loved her husband, Godiva could not reconcile her own growing sense of justice with his disregard for the people's suffering. It was in the midst of this growing conflict that Godiva's most famous act would eventually come to fruition. She had already begun to challenge the norms of her time by speaking out about the plight of the peasants. But she knew that her voice alone would not be enough. It would take an extraordinary act of courage to break through the wall of indifference that surrounded her husband's world, and to finally confront the political system that had created so much suffering. Godiva's growing disillusionment with her marriage and her husband's political views was not just a matter of personal frustration. It was a moral dilemma. She could no longer accept the life that had been mapped out for her as a woman in medieval England. She could no longer simply serve as a figurehead, a noblewoman without agency. The world around her was changing, and Godiva felt the need to take a stand, not just for herself, but for those who had no voice. Her desire to help the common people, to challenge the injustices she saw around her, became a driving force in her life. She knew that her actions could have dire consequences, both for her and for Leofric, but the call for justice was stronger than her fear. The tension between her personal morality and the political realities of her marriage reached a boiling point. For the first time, Godiva saw the potential for real change, but it would require a sacrifice that she could not yet comprehend. As the years passed and the pressures of governance mounted, Godiva knew that her time to act was drawing near. She had spent too long observing the suffering of the people without taking action, and she could not bear to continue living in such a world. The coming months would test not only her marriage but her very sense of self. Would she continue to be a passive observer of history, or would she take a stand and become the symbol of resistance and compassion that history would one day remember her as? Coventry, a town nestled in the heart of Mercia, was a place where the contrast between wealth and poverty were sharply defined. On one side of the coin, there were the grand stone castles, towering structures that symbolized the power of the nobility. Inside these walls, the lords and ladies lived lives of opulence, feasting on sumptuous meals, surrounded by luxury, and making decisions that would affect the lives of those far below them. Yet, just beyond the gates of the castle, life for the common people was harsh and unforgiving. The peasants who lived in Coventry, much like in the rest of England, were bound by a system that kept them in a constant state of servitude to their overlords. They worked the land, tilled the soil, and provided the labor that sustained the lavish lifestyles of the nobles, yet they themselves struggled to survive. The taxes levied upon them were staggering, and the feudal obligations they owed to their lords left them with little to call their own. For the people of Coventry, life was a series of daily struggles. Many families lived in cramped, poorly constructed homes, with little access to food, clean water, or medical care. They were at the mercy of their lords, who controlled the land and the resources. Leofric, as the Earl of Mercia, had power over the entire region, including the lives of the people who lived in it. The taxes he imposed were among the highest in the land, and those who could not pay were often subjected to cruel punishment or further hardship. The disparity between the lives of the nobility and the common folk became more apparent to Godiva with each passing day. As the wife of Leofric, she had access to the wealth and luxury of the castle, but she was not blind to the suffering outside its walls. She saw the poor farmers, the hungry children, and the broken families who were left to survive on scraps. For Godiva, the cruelty of the system was undeniable. The noble classes, her husband included, seemed to care little for the welfare of those who were forced to live in such conditions. The people of Coventry, like peasants all across England, were growing restless. They were tired of bearing the burden of the nobility's demands. The high taxes had driven many to the brink of poverty, and there was little hope of relief. Some had begun to question the system itself, wondering why they should continue to live in such misery while the nobility lived in comfort. Whispers of revolt began to spread, and it was clear that the tension between the nobility and the common folk was nearing a breaking point. Godiva, ever observant of the world around her, began to understand the depth of the discontent that was brewing in Coventry. She could see the frustration in the eyes of the people, the silent anger that simmered beneath the surface. Yet, even as she felt the pull of empathy toward the common folk, she found herself caught between two worlds. She was married to Leofric, the very man who had imposed these taxes and perpetuated the system that kept the people in such desperate conditions. But she was also a woman who had a deep sense of justice, and the suffering of the people weighed heavily on her conscience. Despite the wealth and privilege that came with her position, Godiva could not ignore the growing unrest around her. Her heart ached for the families who were forced to go without food, and the children who played in the streets with hollow eyes. She saw them as victims of a system that had been designed to keep them in poverty. Yet, what could she do? She was just a woman, and in a world dominated by men, her influence was limited. As the wife of a powerful man, her position should have been one of influence, but in reality, she found herself constrained by the very political structures that had elevated her husband to power. It was in this environment of growing discontent that Godiva began to question her role in the grand scheme of things. She had spent years in the comfort of the castle, enjoying the fruits of her husband's success, but she could no longer ignore the suffering of those outside its gates. Her husband, Leofric, was a man of power, but his decisions were causing untold harm to the people of Coventry. The taxes that Leofric levied were necessary for the survival of his land and army, but they were breaking the backs of the common people. And as Godiva began to see the full extent of their suffering, she realized that she could not remain silent any longer. But how could she make a difference? She was just one woman, bound by the constraints of her marriage to a man who was unwilling to change his ways. She had no formal power, no voice in the laws that governed the land. Yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, Godiva began to feel a growing sense of resolve. She could not change the world overnight, but she could challenge the system in a way that might make a difference. Perhaps there was a way to force Leofric to see the suffering of the people and to persuade him to act. Godiva knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The political landscape of medieval England was brutal, and any challenge to the established order was fraught with danger. But as she looked out over the fields of Coventry, seeing the men and women who worked the land under the weight of their burdens, Godiva knew that something had to change. She could no longer live in a world where such injustice prevailed. The moment had come for her to take action, to step beyond the limits of her position, and to try to change the course of history. As the discontent among the people of Coventry grew, so did Godiva's inner turmoil. The town was a microcosm of the wider political struggles taking place across England. The tension between the nobility and the common folk was palpable, and it seemed only a matter of time before the simmering anger would boil over into open rebellion. Yet, Godiva knew that such a rebellion would not only disrupt the fragile peace of the kingdom, but it would also bring untold suffering to the very people she wished to protect. She was trapped between a sense of moral responsibility and the reality of the world in which she lived. Leofric, her husband, was a man of duty and pragmatism. His loyalty to King Edward the Confessor was unquestionable, and his actions were driven by the belief that the kingdom's stability could only be ensured through strength and control. But it was precisely this belief that led to the oppression of the common people. Godiva knew that Leofric's decisions, though born from a desire to protect his land and his people, were causing suffering to those who had the least. He was a ruler in a world that required harsh measures to maintain order, but Godiva could no longer ignore the suffering that lay in the wake of his policies. As she watched the lives of the people deteriorate under the heavy burden of taxes, Godiva's resolve began to harden. She could no longer be complicit in a system that caused so much pain. The cries of the poor and the angry murmurs of rebellion reached her ears daily, and every day her heart grew heavier with the weight of her conscience. She began to question not only her marriage to Leofric, but her entire role in the political system that perpetuated this injustice. But Godiva was no fool. She knew that challenging her husband's authority was not only dangerous, but it could also cost her everything. As the wife of an earl, she held a position of privilege and influence, but she was still bound by the constraints of her gender and the strict societal norms of the time. Women of her rank were not expected to speak out, let alone challenge the political system that upheld the authority of men like Leofric. And yet, the more she thought about the plight of the people in Coventry, the more she realized that her voice, though quiet, could still be heard. Her heart told her to act, but her head warned her of the consequences. Leofric was a man of power, and challenging him would not only bring scandal to their marriage, but would also put her family at risk. But as Godiva walked through the streets of Coventry, hearing the angry whispers of the people, she knew that she could not remain silent forever. The time had come for her to take a stand not just for herself, but for the people she had come to care for. Her resolve solidified one evening as she stood in the castle's great hall, listening to Leofric and his advisors discuss the latest military campaigns. They spoke of taxes and tribute, of land and loyalty, but not once did they mention the people who would suffer the most. The common folk, the ones who toiled in the fields, were mere footnotes in their conversation. Godiva's heart ached as she listened to the cold calculations of the men around her. It was as if the lives of the people meant nothing to them. They were but pawns in a game of power. In that moment, Godiva knew what she had to do. She could no longer stand idly by, pretending that everything was fine. She would not be silenced by the fear of retribution, or by the expectations of society. Her heart told her that the people's suffering had to be addressed, and if no one else would take a stand, she would. The act that she was about to undertake would change the course of history, but it would also come at great personal cost. Godiva approached Leofric the next day, her mind set. She had made up her mind to appeal to him once more, but this time it would be different. She would not ask him for a reduction in taxes. She would demand it. She would challenge his authority, but not in the way that anyone would expect. She would use her own body, her own reputation, to force him to act, to make him see the injustice that he had turned a blind eye to for so long. Her resolve was unshakable. She knew that Leofric would resist her at first, that he would refuse her request as he always had. But she also knew that she had to do something, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. The moment she had been waiting for had arrived. The time for talking was over. It was time for action. Leofric, when Godiva finally made her demand, was taken aback. He had grown accustomed to the quiet obedience of his wife, and her boldness shocked him. But Godiva's words, spoken with a calm yet firm resolve, cut through the complacency of their marriage. She told him, in no uncertain terms, that the suffering of the people could no longer be ignored. The taxes were too high, the people were too poor, and it was time for change. Leofric, in his usual pragmatic manner, hesitated. His loyalty to the crown, his need to maintain control, and his commitment to the established order made him reluctant to yield to Godiva's demands. But Godiva's words struck a chord deep within him. He could not ignore the pain in her eyes, the fierce determination in her voice. He knew that something had to change, but he was unwilling to make the sacrifices that Godiva was asking for. And so, in a moment of desperate frustration, Leofric issued a challenge to his wife. If she was so determined to alleviate the suffering of the people, then she must prove her commitment to them in the most dramatic way possible. He told her that she must ride through the streets of Coventry, naked, as a symbolic act of sacrifice. Only then would he consider reducing the taxes and granting relief to the people. Godiva, though shocked by the severity of the demand, did not flinch. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to make a difference. In that moment, she realized that she had no choice but to take the challenge. The people's suffering demanded it, and so she made her decision. The demand from Leofric came like a thunderclap, reverberating through the walls of the castle and striking deep into Godiva's soul. His words, though spoken with a hint of cold practicality, left no room for doubt. If she truly wanted to ease the burden of the people, she must be willing to prove her dedication to them in the most public and personal way imaginable. To Godiva, his challenge was both a test of her resolve and a desperate attempt to remind her of the power dynamics that governed their world. Godiva stood there, stunned for a moment, trying to process what had just been said. The enormity of the request hung heavily in the air. Leofric, a man known for his military prowess and unyielding approach to governance, had just told her that the only way to earn the relief of the people was to sacrifice her dignity in the most public manner imaginable. She must ride naked through the streets of Coventry, an act that would not only expose her to the eyes of her husband's subjects, but to the ridicule of the very people she was trying to protect. And yet, in that moment of silence, Godiva understood. She had been fighting for the common people's right to relief, but now the cost of that fight had been laid bare. Leofric, ever pragmatic, had put forth a condition that would push her to the extreme. This was no longer just a matter of politics. It was a matter of principle, of personal sacrifice for a greater cause. The challenge was not only to her, but to the very idea of what justice, power, and sacrifice meant in their world. For Godiva, the decision was not an easy one. She could choose to remain silent, to continue in the comfortable position of a noblewoman, to ignore the pleas of the people and live out her days in luxury. Or she could face Leofric's challenge head-on, with the full knowledge that her actions would forever alter the course of history. Her reputation, her position, and perhaps her marriage would be sacrificed in the name of something far greater than her personal desires. The fate of the people of Coventry and her legacy as a symbol of justice and defiance would rest on her ability to take this step. As she stood before Leofric, a man whose loyalty to the crown and to the established order had often stood in opposition to the desires of the people, Godiva made her decision. She would ride through the streets of Coventry. She would strip herself of the dignity and protection that came with her title, her wealth, and her role as Leofric's wife. In doing so, she would force him to act to see the suffering of the people, and to understand that some things could not be measured by gold, power, or status. But even as the decision took root in her heart, a deep sense of fear and uncertainty began to creep in. She was aware of the potential consequences of this act, not just for her, but for her family and her husband's reputation. The act of riding naked through the streets of Coventry would be seen by many as an act of rebellion, a challenge to the very system that had kept the nobility in power for centuries. The scandal it would create could ripple throughout the entire kingdom. Yet, in the face of all this uncertainty, Godiva found a strange sense of peace. This was her moment, her chance to make a difference. She could no longer afford to remain passive, to live in the comfort of her noble status while the people continued to suffer. If this act of defiance, this sacrifice, could change the fate of the people, then it would be worth whatever cost she had to pay. The courage she needed had been within her all along. It was the courage to challenge the very system that had confined her. Leofric, standing before her, could see the resolve in her eyes. He knew she would accept his challenge, despite the personal humiliation it would cause her. In many ways, he had underestimated his wife. He had expected her to yield, to bend to his will, but Godiva had shown him a side of herself that he had never fully understood. She was not just his wife, she was a woman of conviction, a woman capable of defying the very forces that had shaped their lives. And now, in the most dramatic way possible, she was about to test the limits of their marriage, their power, and the political order itself. Godiva, despite the fear that gripped her heart, took a deep breath and nodded. She would ride through Coventry. She would sacrifice her dignity for the sake of the people, and in doing so, she would force Leofric to see the truth of their situation. The act would not only change their world, it would change her forever. But it was a change she was willing to embrace, for the sake of those who had no voice, no power, and no hope. And so, with one final look at Leofric, Godiva made her decision. She would ride through the streets of Coventry, naked and vulnerable, as a symbol of justice, sacrifice, and defiance. The days leading up to Godiva's fateful ride were filled with a quiet tension. Word of her agreement to Leofric's challenge spread like wildfire through the corridors of the castle, and the gossip that followed was both fervent and fearful. The nobles of the court, many of whom had always viewed Godiva as a figure of beauty and grace, were now perplexed and uncertain. Some whispered that she had lost her mind, others that she had taken a step too far in her bid to bring justice to the people. Yet, all of them were secretly watching, awaiting the moment when Lady Godiva would make good on her husband's extraordinary demand. As the day of her ride approached, Godiva spent hours in her private chambers, contemplating the enormity of her decision. The streets of Coventry, once a symbol of her own privilege and power, now seemed to be the arena of her greatest sacrifice. Godiva had never been a stranger to the idea of personal sacrifice. After all, her marriage to Leofric had already required her to forego much of her own autonomy. But this would be a true test of her courage. It would be the ultimate expression of her commitment to the people she had grown to care for. She had been a noblewoman for years, accustomed to the luxuries of the castle and the protection of her position. Now, she was about to strip herself of all that literally and figuratively. Godiva's decision to ride naked through the streets of Coventry was not just an act of protest, it was an act of utter vulnerability, an act that would forever alter her perception of herself and the world around her. In a society that prided itself on social rank, Such an act was not just defiance, it was an expression of total self-sacrifice. Godiva knew that this act would change everything. For the first time, she would no longer be seen as a noblewoman. She would be a symbol of justice, a living embodiment of sacrifice and courage. But with that came a profound fear. Fear of the ridicule she would face. Fear of the judgment of her peers. Fear of the consequences to her marriage and her standing within the court. However, the cries of the people rang in her ears, drowning out her fears. If she could do nothing else, she could make her stand for them. She could give them a voice. On the morning of the ride, Godiva dressed simply, in a robe that she would soon discard, the weight of her decision heavy upon her shoulders. Her servants looked at her with uncertainty, some with pity, others with disbelief. Few could comprehend the depth of her resolve. For them, she was a lady, a noblewoman who should be protected from the harsh realities of the world. But for Godiva, this was her moment to step beyond the walls of privilege and into the heart of the very people she had longed to help. Leofric, aware of the consequences his wife's decision would have, tried to avoid looking directly at her as she prepared. His own feelings were complicated: pride, anger, frustration, and perhaps, in a rare moment, a twinge of admiration. He had made the demand, expecting Godiva to back down, but now he saw that she would not. She was committed to this cause, and her determination was something he could not easily dismiss. In truth, he had never fully understood his wife, her intellect, her compassion, her fierce sense of justice. But now, with the weight of the decision bearing down on them both, he could only watch as she prepared to carry out the impossible. The streets of Coventry were already beginning to stir with activity as Godiva mounted her horse, a powerful and majestic animal that had always carried her in comfort. Today, however, the horse would carry her through the town as a symbol of sacrifice. The people were still unaware of the spectacle that was about to unfold. Some went about their daily business. Others worked in the fields. But whispers spread quickly. The peasants, who had suffered under the burden of taxes and the oppression of the nobility for so long, could feel that something was afoot. They gathered in small groups, eager to learn what was happening. It wasn't long before the word spread like wildfire. Lady Godiva would ride naked through the streets of Coventry, an act that would forever etch her name into history. As Godiva spurred the horse forward, the crowd parted silently, watching her with a mixture of awe, confusion, and disbelief. Godiva's heart beat fiercely in her chest as she rode past the homes of the people, her body exposed to their gaze. But it was not shame that gripped her. It was a sense of purpose, of clarity. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would not only challenge Leofric's authority but also force the nobility to see the suffering of those they had long ignored. The streets were eerily silent, save for the sound of the horse's hooves against the cobblestones and the occasional murmur from the crowd. Godiva rode through the heart of the town, her resolve unshaken, as she faced the very people who had suffered under the system she had married into. She could feel the weight of their gazes upon her, some filled with admiration, others with shock. But Godiva knew that this moment, this act of defiance, was bigger than her. It was for them, for the forgotten people whose lives had been defined by hardship. As she neared the end of her ride, Godiva could hear the murmurs of the crowd turning into applause. The people, moved by her courage, began to cheer. This act of vulnerability, this public sacrifice, had done what words and petitions could not. It had captured their hearts and their attention. For the first time in her life, Godiva was not just a noblewoman in the eyes of the crowd. She was their champion, their symbol of hope. Her ride was not just about the taxes or the relief, it was about the power of the people, the power of one woman's willingness to sacrifice everything for the common good. Godiva knew that this act would not fix everything overnight, but it had made a powerful statement. It had forced the world to reckon with its own injustice. When Godiva finally returned to the castle, her body weary and exposed, the applause of the people still echoed in her ears. Leofric, though silently shocked by the event, knew that his wife had done what he could not. The power had shifted, and in that moment, he understood the true weight of her sacrifice. The streets of Coventry had never witnessed such a spectacle. On the morning when Lady Godiva, in a final act of defiance, rode naked through the heart of the town, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with anticipation, as a mixture of confusion, awe, and shock hung heavy in the crowded streets. The common folk, once invisible in the eyes of the nobility, now found themselves face to face with a woman who had stripped away her dignity in the name of justice. Godiva, whose beauty and grace had once been her defining traits, now stood before them not as a noblewoman, but as a living symbol of rebellion. Her horse, a majestic steed, clopped rhythmically along the cobblestones, its hooves echoing in the silence of the stunned crowd. The people parted before her, some with heads bowed in respect, others staring in disbelief at the sight of a woman noble by birth exposing herself in such a vulnerable yet powerful way. Godiva's skin, once hidden behind layers of expensive garments, was now exposed to the world. But it was not shame that filled her heart as she rode through the streets. It was purpose, a burning need to make a statement that would reverberate through the kingdom. The people of Coventry, who had lived for so long under the crushing weight of taxes and the oppressive rule of their lords, stood silent as she passed. Their lives, defined by the unyielding power of the nobility, had now intersected with the figure of a woman who had dared to challenge that power. There was a certain reverence in the air, as if they could sense that this act was something bigger than the woman herself, something symbolic, something that would not be forgotten. The tension in the streets was palpable. Godiva's ride was not just a physical act, it was an emotional and political one, aimed directly at the heart of the system that had held the common people in thrall for centuries. Leofric, though a powerful earl, had created an environment where the divide between the wealthy nobility and the struggling peasants seemed insurmountable. Godiva's ride was a direct challenge to that system, one that sought to expose the inequality and injustice that had persisted for far too long. As she moved further through the streets, Godiva's heart pounded in her chest. She had been prepared for this moment, yet nothing could have fully prepared her for the reality of the situation. The eyes of the people were upon her, not as a noblewoman, but as a symbol of change. She could hear the gasps, the whispers, and the murmur of the crowd as they watched her. But there was no turning back now. She had made her decision, and this was her moment to stand for those whose voices had been ignored for too long. In the distance, the silhouette of Leofric's castle loomed, a constant reminder of the world she had come from, the world she had challenged. But now, as Godiva's bare skin brushed against the cool morning air, she felt a connection to something deeper, something greater than her position, her marriage, or even her husband. She felt connected to the people of Coventry, to the men and women who had long struggled to survive under a system that favored the few over the many. This was her sacrifice, her offering to those who had been overlooked. By the time she reached the heart of the town, Godiva could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The crowd, once silent in their astonishment, had begun to murmur with a new energy. Some whispered in disbelief, others spoke in awe. But the tone was different. There was a quiet sense of reverence in the air. Godiva could feel it, and for the first time in a long while, she knew that her actions had made an impact. She had succeeded in doing what no one thought possible. She had captured the attention of both the commoners and the nobility, forcing them to reckon with the injustices that had long been ignored. As Godiva turned her horse, slowly making her way back through the streets, she could hear the whispers turn into something else. Applause. It started quietly, a few individuals clapping in recognition of her sacrifice. And then it grew. The sound spread through the streets, echoing off the stone buildings as the people of Coventry acknowledged the courage of the woman who had risked everything for them. Godiva's heart, though heavy with the weight of her sacrifice, swelled with a sense of fulfillment. The act was complete, and its impact was undeniable. She had shown them that it was possible to challenge the system, that it was possible to demand justice, no matter the cost. And for the people of Coventry, it was a moment they would never forget. In Godiva, they saw not just a noblewoman but a hero. Her ride had not only symbolized the injustices they had suffered, but it had also given them hope, the hope that they too could one day stand up to the system that had kept them oppressed. As Godiva returned to the castle, her heart was heavy with the realization that the path ahead would not be easy. The consequences of her actions were still unknown, but she had done what she felt was right. She had taken a stand, and in doing so, had given a voice to the voiceless. Whether Leofric would honor his promise to reduce the taxes, or whether the system would change, was uncertain, but Godiva knew that her actions had set something in motion. The ride through Coventry was not just an act of defiance. It was the beginning of something far larger, something that would continue to echo in the hearts of the people for generations to come. As Godiva returned to the castle, the streets of Coventry still hummed with energy, the applause of the crowd echoing in her mind. The weight of her actions was settling in, but so was the profound realization that she had done something monumental. She had not just ridden through the streets, she had given voice to the oppressed, sparked a fire of hope among the poor, and forced the elite to see the human cost of their power. But what would the aftermath bring? Would Leofric keep his promise? Or would the consequences of her bold act overshadow everything else? The castle, a place that had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt more like a prison. As Godiva entered the familiar stone walls, the air inside seemed heavy with unspoken tension. Leofric was waiting for her, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. Godiva had known the risks when she made her decision. She knew that this act of rebellion would cost her, but the look in her husband's eyes told her just how deep the rift between them had become. The man who had been her partner in this world of power and politics was now her adversary. Leofric stood tall, his posture regal yet stiff, his jaw clenched. He had seen Godiva's ride, witnessed the stir it had caused, and knew the implications of such a bold act. As an earl, he had worked hard to build his power, his reputation. He understood the importance of control and stability. But Godiva's public defiance had shaken that foundation. Her willingness to expose herself in such a vulnerable way was an unprecedented act, one that challenged the very core of his authority. He had not expected her to go so far. "Godiva," Leofric began, his voice low and controlled, "you have done something that cannot be undone. What you did today, it will change everything." His eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, Godiva saw not the husband she had once known, but the ruler, the political figure who would stop at nothing to protect his interests. Godiva met his gaze without flinching. "I did what I had to do, Leofric. The people are suffering, and you cannot ignore them any longer. The taxes are too high, the burdens too great. I could no longer stand by and pretend that this is the way things should be." Leofric's face softened for a moment, but his frustration was palpable. "You've made your point, Godiva, but you have humiliated me in front of everyone. The nobles, the people, what do you think they'll say? You've exposed us both, and I fear the consequences of this act may not be what you imagine." Godiva's heart ached as she listened to him. She understood the weight of his words, the truth behind his concern. But in that moment, she knew that the cost of silence was greater than the cost of defiance. She had sacrificed her dignity for the good of the people, but it was more than just a political statement. It was a moral stand, one that she could not take back, no matter the personal cost. "I knew what this would mean, Leofric. I knew the risks. But sometimes, you have to take risks for change to happen. The people of Coventry cannot live in fear any longer. They need hope, not just empty promises." Leofric's expression hardened again. He stepped closer to her, his gaze unwavering. "And what about us, Godiva? What about our marriage? You've put everything we've built into jeopardy. This act has shaken the very foundation of our relationship, and I cannot pretend that it hasn't." Godiva's breath caught in her throat. She had known that her actions would drive a wedge between them, but the coldness in Leofric's voice stung deeper than she had anticipated. She had acted out of love for the people, but now she could see the personal cost. Would this be the end of their bond? Was her marriage to Leofric, built on political alliance and shared ambition, now irreparably broken? "I did this for the people, Leofric," she said quietly, the words heavy with the weight of truth. "I did it because no one else would. You've always been a man of duty, but the duty of a ruler is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You've made decisions that hurt them, and I could no longer be complicit in that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, laden with all the unspoken emotions and fears that had been building up in their marriage for years. Godiva's heart pounded in her chest. But she stood firm. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. Leofric, still silent, turned away from her and walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling lands that he ruled. His gaze softened as he took in the view, but the weight of the conversation still hung between them. He knew that Godiva's ride had irrevocably changed everything, both for their kingdom and for their marriage. The question now was whether they could rebuild what had been torn apart. Godiva's thoughts were heavy, but she knew that she had taken the right step. She had done something that no one else in her position had dared to do. She had exposed herself, not just physically but morally, to make a statement that would force change. The people of Coventry had witnessed her sacrifice, and she could only hope that her act of defiance would be enough to inspire the shift that was so desperately needed. As Leofric turned back to her, his face was softened by the realization that, while they were still married, something had irreparably changed. The political bond they shared would never be the same again. But Godiva had proven something to him, something that even his steadfast loyalty to his position could not deny. The power of one person's courage could reshape the course of history. The morning after Godiva's unprecedented ride through the streets of Coventry was heavy with tension. The air in the castle felt thick, as if the walls themselves could feel the weight of the choices made the day before. Leofric stood by the window in his study, his eyes distant as he looked out over his lands. He had always taken great pride in his control over Mercia, in the respect and fear he commanded as Earl. But this morning, that power seemed fragile, like a house of cards on the verge of collapse. Godiva's act of defiance had shaken him to his core. He had never expected her to go through with it. In the quiet moments after her ride, he had thought to himself that perhaps she would back down, retreat into the safety of her noble role. But Godiva had done the unthinkable. She had exposed herself literally and figuratively to the eyes of the people and the court. She had placed herself in a vulnerable position, one that could not be undone. Leofric's mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions: anger, shame, frustration, and perhaps a hint of admiration. He was angry at Godiva for challenging him so publicly, for humiliating him in front of their people. He had always been the one to make the decisions, to uphold the authority of the crown and the nobility. Now, his wife had done something that made him feel powerless, and the political ramifications of her actions were starting to set in. But there was also something else, something he had never fully recognized in Godiva until now. Her courage, her willingness to sacrifice everything for the people of Coventry, was not something that could be ignored. Even in his anger, he had to acknowledge that her actions had made a statement he had failed to make. The tension between them was palpable. Godiva had crossed a line, and Leofric could not simply let it slide. But what could he do? She had acted out of her love for the people, out of her growing dissatisfaction with the suffering that had long been a part of their world. Could he, as a ruler, ignore the truth of her words? Could he continue to ignore the cries of the people who had been oppressed for so long? His heart told him one thing, but his pride, his duty to the nobility, told him another. Leofric turned away from the window, his thoughts racing. He knew that the nobles would be watching, waiting to see how he would respond to his wife's defiance. They would expect him to take control of the situation, to reassert his authority and put Godiva in her place. But the truth was that he no longer knew how to do that. She had forced his hand. In a way, Godiva had done what he could not. She had made him see the injustice that had been perpetuated under his rule. The taxes, the oppression, the suffering of the people. All of it had been swept under the rug for too long. And now, the dust had been kicked up in the most dramatic way possible. He could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, and he turned to see Godiva standing in the doorway of his study. She looked as she always did, elegant, composed, but there was a fire in her eyes that he had not seen before. She had made her statement, and now she was ready to face the consequences. Leofric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He knew that they could no longer go back to the way things had been. Godiva's actions had changed everything. He had been the one to impose the laws, the taxes, the policies that had kept the people in subjugation. But now, he realized that perhaps it was time for change. The question was, could he bring himself to make that change? Could he let go of the power and control that had been the foundation of his life for so long? Godiva stepped into the room, her gaze steady, unwavering. "Leofric," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I did what I had to do. The people are suffering, and I could no longer stay silent. You've seen it. You've heard it. The taxes, the burdens, they're killing them." Leofric did not respond immediately. He knew that Godiva was right. The suffering of the people had become undeniable. But admitting that she had been right all along, was a difficult pill to swallow. He had built his power by standing firm, by showing strength and resolve. But now he was being forced to question everything he had believed in. "You've humiliated me, Godiva," he said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "You've undermined my authority in front of the very people we rule. They'll talk. They'll think we are weak." Godiva stood tall before him, her gaze unwavering. "I did not do it to humiliate you, Leofric. I did it because the people are dying, because they need someone to speak for them. I am not weak. I am not afraid to stand for what is right, even if it costs me everything." Leofric's jaw clenched. He had always respected Godiva's intellect and beauty, but now he was seeing another side of her, a side that both frightened and fascinated him. She had always been a supportive wife, one who had never questioned his decisions. But now, she was challenging him in a way he could not ignore. The silence between them was thick, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Leofric knew he could not simply disregard what had happened, but he also knew that change was not something that could be achieved without sacrifice. Would he listen to Godiva's call for reform? Or would he double down on his own authority and continue down the path he had always known? Godiva, sensing the shift in the air, stepped closer to him, her voice softer now. "Leofric, we can make a difference. The people need us to lead with compassion, not just power. You've always been a strong leader, but now we need to lead with fairness." Leofric turned to face her, his expression conflicted. She was right. The people were speaking, and they had been speaking for years. They had been ignored, their pleas unheard. Perhaps it was time for a change, not just for Godiva's sake, but for the kingdom. For the first time in years, Leofric felt the weight of his responsibility to the people, not just to the crown. But the question remained, could he let go of the old ways? Could he abandon the rigid control he had held so tightly to for so long? The silence between Leofric and Godiva stretched, thick and suffocating. Leofric stood at the center of his study, his back straight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mind was racing, torn between his long-held beliefs about power, control, and duty, and the new reality that Godiva's bold actions had thrust him into. His wife had, without question, shaken the very foundation of their marriage and his rule. Godiva had always been an important part of his life, but until now, she had been a passive partner in their world of politics and power. Her actions, though born out of compassion, had pushed her into the spotlight, and now they stood together in a place neither of them had ever imagined, on the precipice of change. Leofric could feel his own pride battling against the realization that Godiva's demands were not entirely unreasonable. She had made her statement, one that resonated not only with the common folk but with him as well. The suffering of the people, once something he had kept at a distance, had now become undeniable. But could he, as a ruler, sacrifice the very things that had made him who he was, for the sake of reform? Godiva, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward. Her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and hope. "Leofric, we cannot continue like this. The people cannot continue to suffer. We can make a difference together, but we have to be willing to take that first step." Leofric looked at her, searching her face, trying to understand her drive. She was not the woman he had married all those years ago, submissive, dutiful, quiet. This was someone who had awakened, someone with the courage to change not only the course of their marriage but the future of the kingdom. And, deep down, he knew that the change she was advocating was inevitable. He had spent his life in control, making decisions that affected the lives of so many. But control, he now realized, was a brittle thing. It was built on fear, and fear could only hold power for so long. Godiva's ride had shattered that illusion. The people saw her bravery, her willingness to give up everything for them, and in that they saw a strength that no army or law could enforce. Leofric took a deep breath, finally speaking. "What you did, Godiva, it was bold, too bold perhaps, but it's clear that something needs to change. I see it now. I see the truth in your words. But what does that mean for us? For me?" He shook his head, his voice quiet, almost unsure. "What happens to the power I've built? What happens to the kingdom I've worked my whole life to protect?" Godiva's expression softened. "Leofric, you've protected the kingdom, but at what cost? Power built on fear and control doesn't last. It only breeds more fear. What we need now is change, not just for the people but for us. You've always been a protector of the land, but we can be protectors of the people too. The two can go hand in hand." Leofric turned away from her, looking out over the lands he had spent his life managing. His eyes lingered on the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the sky with light. For the first time in years, Leofric felt uncertain. His rule had always been based on an unyielding foundation, one that he had built through strength and authority. But now, the ground beneath him seemed to be shifting, and he was left to wonder if the foundations he had constructed were truly strong, or if they had only been a facade. Godiva's words, her sacrifice, had cracked that facade. The suffering of the people had become his own burden to bear. He knew now that to continue down the path he had been on would only lead to more resentment, more revolt, and ultimately, more suffering. He could not ignore the truth any longer. The people had spoken, and through Godiva's defiance, their voices had been heard louder than ever before. "What are you asking of me, Godiva?" Leofric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of ruler do you want me to be?" Godiva approached him slowly, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. "I'm asking you to listen, truly listen. The people have endured enough. You've always been a man of power and strength. Now, we need to show that true strength is in compassion, in fairness, in hearing the cries of those who've been left behind." Leofric turned back to face her, and for the first time he saw the depth of her conviction. This wasn't just about taxes or the kingdom, it was about something more fundamental. It was about fairness, about justice, and about the kind of legacy they would leave behind. Was he willing to let go of his iron grip on power to create something more lasting, something that could change the future of England? The weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders. Leofric had always prided himself on his ability to lead, to command. But he had never truly understood what leadership meant until now. Power without compassion was nothing more than tyranny, and Godiva had shown him the true cost of that. "I can't promise everything will change overnight," Leofric said, his voice still thick with the weight of his decision. "But I will listen, and I will work with you to find a way to ease the suffering. I will speak to the nobles, and we will figure out a way to lower the taxes. We will make changes, even if it's difficult." Godiva's heart lifted as she heard his words. There was no guarantee of success, no certainty that everything would be fixed. But for the first time, Leofric was willing to try. He was willing to take the first step towards something better. For Godiva, it was a victory, though she knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But the change had begun, and that, she knew, was the most important thing. The days following Godiva's ride through the streets of Coventry were filled with a strange mixture of tension and hope. The common people, once resigned to the harsh reality of their lives under the nobility's rule, were now stirred by something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Lady Godiva, the noblewoman they had always known by her beauty and grace, had become something more, something they had never dared to imagine. She had become their champion, their symbol of justice, and for the first time, they believed that change might be possible. Godiva, in the days after her defiance, found herself in the unexpected position of being a hero to those she had once viewed as distant and detached. The streets of Coventry, where she had once only walked as the wife of the Earl, were now filled with murmurs of admiration and gratitude for her bravery. The people she had silently observed for so many years now spoke her name with reverence, their eyes filled with gratitude and newfound hope. Godiva had, without intending to, become the figurehead of a movement that aimed to address the wrongs done to the common folk by the system that had been in place for so long. The implications of her ride went far beyond the streets of Coventry. It was a powerful statement that rippled through the kingdom, reaching even the ears of the other nobles who were beginning to realize that Godiva's actions could not be dismissed so easily. The nobility had always ruled through strength and intimidation, but Godiva had shown that true power could come from compassion and sacrifice. Her ride had not just been an act of rebellion. It had been a call for reform, for a recognition of the humanity of those who had been oppressed for centuries. But as the praise of the people grew louder, Godiva found herself in a precarious position. She had made her stand, but the consequences of that stand were only beginning to unfold. The political landscape had shifted, and though she had the support of the common folk, she was still very much in the midst of a battle with the nobility. Leofric, though he had agreed to some changes, was still bound by the weight of his title and the expectations of those around him. The road ahead would not be an easy one, but Godiva knew that she could not go back. She had stepped into a new role, one that she could never have imagined before. Now, as the people rallied behind her, Godiva had to decide how she would move forward. Would she continue to fight for the reforms she believed in? Would she use her newfound influence to push Leofric further? Or would she be forced to compromise with the political powers that still ruled over her world? As she walked through the streets of Coventry, the cheers of the people ringing in her ears, Godiva felt the weight of her decision more than ever. She had opened a door that could never be closed again. She had defied the traditional roles of a noblewoman, had exposed herself literally and figuratively in the name of justice. And now, she would have to navigate the complex world of politics and power in a way she never had before. Godiva had always been a woman of compassion, but now she was a woman of power as well. The challenge before her was not only to navigate the complicated relationship with her husband, Leofric, but to determine how far she was willing to go to bring about the changes she had called for. She had awakened something within herself, a fierce desire to fight for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. But as the days went by, she realized that the true cost of leadership was not just public sacrifice. It was also the loss of comfort, security, and sometimes even the safety of loved ones. The consequences of Godiva's ride were far-reaching, and though her actions had sparked a movement among the people, it was unclear how much real change would occur. The nobility, though shaken, was not ready to abandon the system that had allowed them to rule for so long. Leofric, though willing to make some concessions, was still the Earl of Mercia, and his position demanded that he maintain control. Godiva was not foolish enough to think that her ride had solved all the problems, but she had opened the door to a conversation that had long been avoided. For Godiva, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She was no longer just the wife of Leofric. She was the voice of the people, the woman who had risked everything to make their suffering known. The challenge now was to harness that power, to build on the momentum she had created, and to ensure that the changes she had begun would continue. In the aftermath of her bold ride, Lady Godiva found herself standing at a precipice. The streets of Coventry, once a place where she moved in relative anonymity as the wife of the Earl of Mercia, now became a symbol of her sacrifice. The people, who had long been invisible in the eyes of the nobility, looked at her with a new kind of reverence. She had exposed herself not only physically but also politically and morally in a way that no noblewoman had ever dared before. And in doing so, she had become their champion. But while the cheers of the people still rang in her ears, Godiva knew that her journey was only just beginning. The applause, the gratitude, the respect, these were all temporary. The real work, the hard work, lay ahead. She had stirred the hearts of the common folk, but the political climate was far from conducive to the sweeping changes she envisioned. The nobility, though shaken by her defiance, were still very much in control, and her husband Leofric, though he had agreed to some concessions, remained entrenched in the old ways. For Godiva, the weeks that followed her ride were filled with a strange sense of purpose and uncertainty. She knew she had done the right thing by challenging the established order, but the realization of what she had set in motion began to weigh on her. Leofric, though he had promised to ease the suffering of the people, still struggled with the idea of fundamentally changing the system that had granted him power. He had always been a man of duty and tradition, and though he was now listening to her, his actions would be slower to follow. But Godiva was not the woman she had once been. Her ride had transformed her. It had given her the courage to step outside the constraints of her role as the wife of Leofric and into the role of an active participant in the shaping of the kingdom's future. No longer just a figurehead or a silent partner, Godiva had become a force in her own right, one whose actions could no longer be ignored. As she moved through the streets of Coventry, the crowds that once simply acknowledged her presence now stopped to cheer her. They saw her not just as a noblewoman, but as someone who had given everything for them. And in their eyes, Godiva had become a beacon of hope. Hope for a future where the aristocracy was no longer insulated from the struggles of the common folk, where the gap between the two classes might one day be bridged. But the reality of her new role was not without its challenges. Though the people had embraced her, the nobles were far less forgiving. The whispers behind closed doors grew louder, and Godiva could feel the growing tension between her and the court. Leofric, though supportive of some reforms, had made it clear that he was not willing to abandon his position or his allegiance to the crown. Godiva had always known that change would not come easily, but now she realized just how deeply entrenched the system was. Her ride had ignited something powerful, but it was clear that the fight for justice would not be won with one act of courage. And yet, Godiva felt a strange sense of peace amidst the chaos. The weight of her actions, the sacrifices she had made, now seemed less daunting. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she also knew that she could no longer go back to the life she had once lived. She had become a symbol, and that symbol carried with it both power and responsibility. Leofric, for all his power and authority, was now faced with a new dilemma. The political landscape had shifted, and the pressure was mounting on him to make good on the promises he had made to his wife. He could not afford to ignore the will of the people any longer, but at the same time, he was loath to relinquish the control he had spent so many years building. His position was precarious, and though he had agreed to some reforms, Godiva's growing influence was something he could no longer dismiss as a fleeting moment of defiance. The nobles, too, were watching closely. They feared what Godiva's rise could mean for their own status and power. To them, her actions were dangerous, a threat to the established order that had served them well for generations. But as Godiva continued to push for change, to challenge the status quo, they found themselves at a crossroads. Would they support her cause, or would they seek to quash her influence before it spread too far? For Godiva, the challenge was not just political, it was personal. She had given everything to this cause, and yet she knew that the personal cost could be even greater than the political one. She had sacrificed her dignity, her safety, and her place in society. But the hardest sacrifice was the one she feared most, the loss of her relationship with Leofric. Theirs had always been a marriage of political convenience, but there had been a time when they had cared for each other. Would that bond survive the changes that were coming? Or would Godiva be forced to choose between her duty to the people and her loyalty to the man she had once loved? As the weeks passed, Godiva found herself increasingly at odds with Leofric. Their conversations, once filled with discussion of politics and strategy, now became heated debates about the future of the kingdom. Godiva had never been one to shy away from a fight, but the weight of these conversations felt different. She was no longer just fighting for her own beliefs. She was fighting for the future of the people she had come to care for. Leofric, for all his wisdom and power, seemed unwilling to fully embrace the changes that were necessary. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of their chambers, Godiva looked at Leofric, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. "You see it now, don't you?" she asked softly. "The people are crying out for change. They want a better life, a life where they aren't just tools for the rich to use. We can make that change, Leofric, but it won't happen unless we act together." Leofric met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "And what do you want from me, Godiva? I've agreed to the taxes. I've agreed to the reforms. But how far should we go? What are we really sacrificing for these people?" Godiva's voice grew firm, determined. "We are sacrificing nothing but our pride, Leofric. You speak of power, but power means nothing if it is built on the suffering of others. We can be better than this. We have to be." Leofric looked away, his brow furrowed in thought. The path before him was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The world Godiva had awakened was not one he could ignore. For better or for worse, they would have to navigate this new reality together. Lady Godiva's act of defiance, the naked ride through the streets of Coventry, became an event that would transcend her own time and place, morphing into legend over the centuries. At first, the event was simply a bold political act, a woman's desperate attempt to secure relief for the common folk and challenge a deeply entrenched system. But over time, the details of her ride and the motivations behind it began to take on an air of myth as storytelling blurred the lines between fact and fiction. In the weeks and months following her ride, Godiva's actions became the subject of conversation among both commoners and nobles. Among the people, her defiance was seen as a noble sacrifice, a woman who had risked everything to give a voice to the voiceless. For the first time, the peasants felt that they were not invisible, that their suffering had been noticed. In their eyes, Godiva became a hero, a symbol of hope and defiance. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, a woman willing to endure personal humiliation for the sake of justice. But for the nobility, Godiva's ride was not so easily forgiven. Whispers in the halls of the aristocracy painted her as both a rebellious wife and a political agitator. Leofric, once the trusted and powerful Earl of Mercia, found his authority questioned by those who had always supported him. The nobles saw Godiva's actions as a challenge not just to her husband, but to the very foundation of their society. In their eyes, her ride was an act of defiance that threatened to unravel the established order. It was clear that her actions had caused a ripple effect that would be felt for generations, even if those in power tried to deny it. But history, as it often does, would take the story of Lady Godiva and mold it into something more than it was. The simple truth of her naked ride through Coventry, the desperate plea of a noblewoman who cared for the suffering of the common people, would eventually fade in the face of the myth that would be born. The story of Godiva's ride, passed down through the generations, would transform her into a symbol of both sacrifice and sensuality, stripped of the political context and elevated into the realm of legend. The legend of Godiva, as it would be told in the centuries that followed, would emphasize the dramatic nature of her ride. In some versions of the story, she rode completely naked, while in others, she was clothed only in her long hair. The townspeople, as the legend goes, were ordered to remain inside their homes and close their windows. But one man, often referred to as Peeping Tom, could not resist the temptation to spy on Godiva as she passed. In some versions of the legend, Tom is struck blind as a punishment for his voyeurism. This version of the story, though a far cry from the reality of Godiva's original act, would become the most well-known part of the tale. The actual motivations behind Godiva's ride, her desire to bring justice to the people and challenge the oppressive taxation imposed by her husband, would be overshadowed by the focus on the dramatic and sensational aspects of the ride itself. The legend that emerged would reduce her actions to mere spectacle, stripping away the social and political implications that had fueled her courage. The Godiva of legend would be remembered not as a political activist or a champion of the poor, but as a woman who made a public sacrifice to show her beauty, and, in some versions of the tale, as a symbol of unbridled sensuality. But in the hearts of those who truly understood the context of her actions, Godiva's ride was always about more than the legend that would be born from it. It was about a woman's courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. It was about her willingness to expose herself both literally and figuratively to make a point about the injustice she saw around her. The historical Godiva, the woman who risked everything to challenge the system, would be overshadowed by the mythical Godiva, who was often portrayed as little more than a figure of erotic fantasy. In the annals of history, however, the real Godiva would not be completely forgotten. Her legacy, though distorted over time, remained as a symbol of the fight for justice, equality, and the courage it took to challenge the status quo. The impact of her ride would not be immediately felt, but the seeds she had planted would grow over time. Her courage would inspire future generations, especially women, to stand up for their rights and challenge the inequalities they faced. It was not only her political defiance that would be remembered, but also her unwavering commitment to the people. Godiva's actions reminded the kingdom of the need for empathy and compassion in leadership. The stark contrast between her compassion for the suffering of the common people and her husband's commitment to maintaining the status quo would define the way she was remembered. In the end, Godiva's ride was a call for reform, a call that would be echoed throughout history, in different forms and through different voices, until it was finally answered. As the years passed, the tale of Lady Godiva's ride evolved, weaving its way through the tapestry of English folklore. What began as a daring act of political defiance, motivated by a deep sense of empathy for the common people, gradually transformed into a legend imbued with elements of fantasy and morality. Godiva became a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and ultimately, beauty. A legend wrapped in the trappings of mythology, detached from the social and political realities of her time. The truth of Godiva's motivations, her courage to confront the oppressive tax system and demand justice for the people, was gradually obscured. Instead, the focus shifted to her physical vulnerability, the image of a noblewoman riding through the streets naked, a spectacle meant to evoke not political change, but awe and curiosity. This image, coupled with the infamous figure of Peeping Tom, would become the central story told in retellings of Godiva's ride, with many versions focusing not on her challenge to the aristocratic order, but on the sensuality of the act and the punishment of the voyeur who dared to gaze upon her. In many versions of the story, the legend morphed to emphasize her purity and beauty. The emphasis on her nakedness, combined with the idea of the shamed townsfolk who must remain behind closed doors, led to interpretations that turned her ride into an allegory for chastity and moral virtue. Her public sacrifice was recast as a metaphor for a deeper kind of purity, untainted by the corruption of the world around her. In some versions, her long, flowing hair became a symbol of her modesty, as if her willingness to expose herself to the world was a kind of divine act, her beauty and sacrifice a testament to her virtuous nature. This transformation of Lady Godiva's story also spoke to the changing values of society. The medieval world, with its rigid structures of power, class, and morality, often looked to stories of sacrifice and virtue to teach lessons about the dangers of pride, vanity, and unchecked desire. Godiva's ride was recast not only as a defiance of political power, but also as a test of personal virtue and moral strength. As a result, the legend of Lady Godiva became a moral fable that was told and retold across generations, particularly in periods when society sought to enforce traditional values of modesty and humility. However, despite the distortion of her story over time, traces of Godiva's original intent remained. For those who dug beneath the layers of myth, the core of her story still rang true. A woman willing to sacrifice everything, her dignity, her position, and her comfort, to expose the injustices of her time. Her act of defiance, whether seen as an erotic spectacle or an act of political courage, had sparked a conversation that could not be easily forgotten. And in that conversation, Godiva's true legacy was born not as a symbol of chastity, but as a symbol of bold, unwavering defiance against a corrupt system. Over the centuries, as England entered periods of political upheaval and social change, Godiva's legacy became more than just a story of a noblewoman on horseback. It became a symbol of resistance. The tale of her ride was invoked by reformers and revolutionaries who saw in Godiva's courage a rallying cry for the oppressed, for those who had no voice in the halls of power. As the country moved through the tumult of the medieval and early modern periods, her ride was remembered as a call for justice and a reminder that true power came not from wealth or land, but from the ability to act with courage and integrity. In art and literature, the image of Lady Godiva riding through the streets of Coventry continued to capture the public imagination. She was depicted in paintings and poems, often as a tragic heroine, a woman whose beauty and bravery set her apart from the society that demanded her submission. Her story was retold with variations, from dramatic renderings of her naked ride to more restrained versions that focused on her internal struggle and the personal cost of her actions. The legend's influence extended beyond English borders as well. In Europe, Godiva's ride was incorporated into the cultural fabric of various societies, often seen as a symbol of feminine strength. In some versions, she was even portrayed as a precursor to the feminist ideals that would later emerge. her defiance a forerunner to the struggle for gender equality. As time wore on, Lady Godiva's legend grew more romanticized, more distant from the gritty political reality that had birthed it. The historical Godiva, the wife of Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, who had witnessed the suffering of her people and demanded action, became lost in the myths of a woman on horseback, riding through the town for nothing more than a grand gesture. But for those who sought to understand the true significance of her ride, the reality remained clear. Godiva was not just a figure of legend, but a woman who used her position to challenge the power structures of her time, and in doing so, left an indelible mark on history. Even as the centuries passed and new generations came to know her only through the veil of myth, the spirit of Godiva's act lived on. Her willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice, her courage to stand alone in a world that sought to silence her, became a beacon for those who dared to challenge the status quo. Lady Godiva was no longer just a historical figure. She had become a symbol of courage, compassion, and rebellion. A woman whose legacy, though mythologized, remained a powerful reminder of the potential for change in a world that often resisted it. As the centuries passed, the story of Lady Godiva, once a bold act of political defiance, grew beyond its original context, transforming into one of the most enduring legends of medieval England. While the core of Godiva's story remained rooted in her courage and the sacrifice she made for the common people, the legend took on new layers of meaning in the collective imagination. From literature to art to popular culture, Lady Godiva became more than just a noblewoman challenging a tyrannical tax system. She became a symbol of feminine strength, sacrifice, and rebellion. The first significant shift in Godiva's image came with the advent of the Renaissance. As Europe entered a new cultural age that celebrated humanism and individualism, Godiva's story was retold through a different lens. In this period of renewed interest in classical themes and heroic narratives, Lady Godiva's act of defiance was not simply seen as a desperate plea for justice, but as a moral and virtuous act. Her naked ride through the streets of Coventry, once a direct challenge to the oppressive taxation and political system, became more of a symbol of purity, chastity, and personal sacrifice. This transformation into an icon of virtue was reinforced by her depiction in various artistic works, where she was portrayed as both beautiful and noble, often with her long hair flowing to preserve her modesty. One of the most famous early artistic representations of Lady Godiva came from the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in the 19th century. Artists like John Collier and others sought to capture the sensuality and mystery of her legendary ride, depicting Godiva in a way that emphasized her beauty, her vulnerability, and her boldness. These portrayals were not simply about the political and social messages of her actions, but about celebrating her as a tragic, almost divine figure. In these paintings, Godiva became a larger-than-life symbol of feminine beauty and grace, as well as courage. She was the epitome of the sacrificial woman, one whose beauty was both her strength and her burden. As these artistic interpretations spread, Lady Godiva's image began to solidify as a romantic and heroic figure. Her ride, once a political act in the context of medieval England, was now framed as an allegory for the struggle between innocence and corruption, purity and sensuality, the personal and the political. Her transformation into a romanticized figure removed much of the gritty, political significance of her original act, focusing instead on the drama and spectacle of her ride. Her presence in popular culture grew as well. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Godiva's legend began to infiltrate literature, theater, and even early film. She was portrayed not just as a historical figure, but as an archetype of the suffering woman who sacrifices everything for the greater good. Her story was recast in different forms, from novels to plays, and her legendary ride through Coventry became a symbol of the battle for personal freedom and social justice. In literature, Godiva's mythic stature was explored by writers who focused on her symbolic importance. She became a character not just defined by her ride, but by her rebellion against the established order. In this version of her legend, she represented the oppressed not only for the common folk she fought for, but also as a symbol of the struggle against the subjugation of women in a patriarchal society. Writers in both the 19th and 20th centuries utilized her story to critique the gender norms and societal constraints of their own times. using Lady Godiva as an emblem of empowerment. Her image continued to evolve in the modern era, especially in the 20th century, when the rise of feminism and changing societal values brought her back into the cultural conversation. Feminist writers and activists saw in Godiva a precursor to the modern struggle for women's rights. Her willingness to expose herself publicly, to step beyond the bounds of what society expected of her, became a metaphor for the feminist movement's fight for bodily autonomy and gender equality. She was no longer just a symbol of medieval sacrifice, but a figure who could be reclaimed by contemporary women who saw in her a model of personal and political empowerment. In the popular media, Lady Godiva's image took on new forms. From television shows to advertising, her likeness was used to sell everything from chocolates to clothing, often detached entirely from the original social context of her story. These portrayals, though often commercialized and sanitized, kept Godiva's legacy alive, ensuring that her name continued to be recognized and associated with beauty, sacrifice, and courage. Her story also began to be reimagined in modern retellings, where Godiva's ride became not just a historical moment, but a dramatic, cinematic event. Filmmakers and television producers drew on the power of her legend to tell stories of women fighting for justice, women willing to defy the norms of their time for the greater good. Godiva was no longer just a medieval figure, but a timeless icon of rebellion. Yet, even as her image was transformed and commercialized, there remained an underlying awareness that the core of her story, her fight against injustice, and her willingness to sacrifice for the common good, was far more profound than the myth that had evolved. For all the glamour and romanticization of her image, Godiva's original act of defiance remained a reminder of the power of individual action to confront systemic oppression. It was a message that resonated through time, particularly during moments of political and social change, when the need for heroes like Lady Godiva felt more urgent. As Lady Godiva's legend continued to evolve in the modern world, her story became a powerful symbol for various causes and movements. By the 20th century, the feminist movement, civil rights activists, and political reformers began to embrace her myth, using it as a tool to challenge societal norms and advocate for social justice. Her journey from a historical figure to a symbol of female empowerment had reached its peak during this time, and the implications of her act were not just confined to medieval politics, but became a universal metaphor for resistance against oppression. One of the most significant ways in which Lady Godiva was reinvigorated in the public imagination was through her association with feminism. In the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, as women's rights movements were gaining momentum around the world, Godiva's ride was often invoked as a symbol of women's courage in fighting against both societal constraints and patriarchal power structures. Her defiance, her public display of vulnerability, and her willingness to sacrifice her personal dignity for a larger cause resonated deeply with women who were, like Godiva, pushing back against the limits imposed on them by tradition and society. In Godiva, they saw a reflection of their own struggles, whether for the right to vote, the right to control their own bodies, or the right to be taken seriously in a male-dominated world. The image of Godiva riding through Coventry, starkly exposed, became a symbol of radical transparency and self-expression. It represented not only defiance against authority, but also the reclamation of women's bodies as their own. The feminist interpretation of her story focused less on her nakedness as an object of sexualized attention and more on the power of her agency, her ability to command attention and demand change despite the overwhelming risks. Lady Godiva was, in this reading, a feminist icon who acted out of a desire for justice, one whose very vulnerability became her strength. Her story also had particular resonance for women in the performing arts. Throughout the 20th century, Lady Godiva appeared in numerous stage plays, novels, and films, often reinterpreted through a feminist lens. One of the most famous works was the 1955 novel Godiva, written by the American author and feminist activist Mildred T. Ross. The book retold Godiva's story, portraying her not only as a symbol of defiance but as a woman with complex emotions and a deep commitment to her ideals. Ross's interpretation sought to humanize the legend, providing a more nuanced exploration of her inner struggles and the moral weight of her sacrifice. In visual arts, Godiva's image continued to be a popular subject of artistic reinterpretation. Various painters, sculptors, and photographers drew upon the power of her ride to make statements about societal norms and gender roles. One of the most famous modern depictions was the work of renowned feminist artist Judy Chicago, who, in the 1970 seconds, created a series of works that featured Godiva as a symbol of female strength and independence. Chicago's artwork depicted Godiva not as a passive figure of beauty, but as a powerful, defiant force, someone whose very vulnerability made her even more formidable. Lady Godiva's symbolic power was also embraced in the world of advertising, perhaps more controversially. Her image, associated with sensuality and sacrifice, was used to sell everything from chocolates to cars. But as with many iconic symbols, her legacy in advertising often reduced her to a mere object of fascination and spectacle. While some argued that this commercialization undermined the deeper political implications of her ride, others saw it as an indication of how far her influence had spread in popular culture. Godiva had, in many ways, become a commodity, an image that could be repurposed for a variety of cultural and commercial agendas. In music, Lady Godiva's name became synonymous with liberation and rebellion. In the 1960 seconds, the British rock band The Velvet Underground released a song titled Lady Godiva's Operation, which explored themes of transformation, defiance, and escape from societal constraints. In the song, the band used Godiva's legend as a metaphor for personal metamorphosis and breaking free from the limitations imposed by others. This connection between Godiva and themes of freedom, self-expression, and revolution resonated with the countercultural movements of the time, which saw her as a symbol of breaking free from the shackles of tradition. Godiva's place in popular culture even expanded into modern television and film. In various adaptations, her story was frequently reinterpreted to serve the changing political climates of the time. Most notably, the character of Godiva appeared in television dramas and series that dealt with issues of gender, power, and identity. She was often portrayed as a tragic heroine, her life and legacy reduced to a series of symbolic moments that reflected the struggles of women across generations. Yet, despite the changing mediums and interpretations, the central elements of Godiva's legend remained unchanged. A woman who, against all odds, stood up for what she believed in, who sacrificed everything for a greater cause, and who left an indelible mark on history. Today, Lady Godiva's legacy endures not only in historical scholarship but also in the popular consciousness. Her story continues to be passed down through generations, each retelling offering new insights and interpretations. For some, she is a feminist icon, a figure of bravery and resistance. For others, she remains a symbol of beauty and sensuality, a figure whose nakedness became the ultimate expression of her strength. In all her iterations, Godiva's legacy serves as a powerful reminder that true change often comes from the most unexpected sources. A single act of defiance, a single moment of courage, can echo across centuries, shaping the course of history and inspiring those who follow. The story of Lady Godiva, rooted in a singular act of courage, has endured through the centuries, transforming from a historical event into one of the most iconic legends in English folklore. What began as an act of defiance against an unjust tax system evolved into something far greater, a symbol of sacrifice, empowerment, and resistance. Lady Godiva's ride through the streets of Coventry was not just a political statement. It became a defining moment, a story that transcended its time and place, touching upon universal themes of justice, equality, and the human spirit. At its core, Godiva's ride was an act of personal sacrifice. One woman's willingness to expose herself, both literally and metaphorically, to challenge the oppression faced by the common people. The context of the act, driven by a desire to ease the suffering of the people of Coventry, speaks to the heart of social justice movements, both in her time and in the years that followed. But over time, as her story became entrenched in legend, it was transformed into something more mythic, often stripped of its political roots and reduced to a tale of sacrifice and purity. In the centuries that followed, Lady Godiva's story became a symbol of rebellion and strength. The legend that emerged was no longer just about the political struggle between the aristocracy and the common folk. It became a story of feminine virtue and courage. Her naked ride, once a bold political act, was often romanticized as an image of purity and selflessness, a metaphor for the struggle between innocence and corruption. This shift in interpretation reflects how Godiva's story was reshaped to fit the needs and values of each successive era. By the time of the Renaissance, Godiva's legend had already begun to take on a more symbolic meaning. The idea of a noblewoman exposing herself for the greater good fit neatly into the period's focus on humanism and individualism. Godiva's defiance was seen not only as a challenge to the tax system but also as an expression of moral virtue, self-sacrifice, and purity. Her bravery was framed not as a radical political act, but as a demonstration of personal virtue. Her beauty and vulnerability became central to her image, elevating her to the status of a symbolic figure, representing moral rectitude and heroism. As centuries passed, Lady Godiva's legend was further romanticized, particularly in the 19th century, when she became a muse for artists, writers, and poets. Her image was portrayed in various forms of art, with the most famous being the pre-Raphaelite depictions of her in paintings such as Lady Godiva by John Collier. In these works, Godiva was not just a political figure, but an idealized woman. Her ride through Coventry becoming a dramatic act of sacrifice and beauty. Artists highlighted her nakedness as a symbol of her purity, framing her as both a victim and a hero, a woman whose courage and vulnerability were inextricably linked. By the 20th century, as feminist movements gained momentum, Lady Godiva's image was reclaimed as a symbol of women's empowerment. The original political implications of her ride, once obscured by layers of romanticism and myth, resurfaced as Godiva became an icon of resistance. The feminist interpretation of her story emphasized her courage to defy societal norms, to expose herself not just physically but politically, as a challenge to the power structures that sought to control and oppress. In this light, Lady Godiva's ride was seen not just as a personal sacrifice, but as an act of revolutionary defiance. Her story found resonance with the feminist ideals of autonomy, equality, and bodily integrity. Godiva's willingness to expose herself to public scrutiny was viewed as a powerful metaphor for the struggle for women's rights and the control of their own bodies. She became a symbol of women's agency, someone who used her position to challenge the injustices of her time, risking everything for a cause greater than herself. Through this lens, Godiva became a precursor to the modern feminist movement, her legacy now intertwined with the ongoing fight for women's equality and liberation. In the popular imagination, Lady Godiva continued to evolve, and her story was reinterpreted in various forms. From literature to film, television to advertising, her image was used to convey messages of defiance, beauty, and strength. In many modern retellings, Godiva was not merely a symbol of beauty and sacrifice, but a model for resistance, a reminder that personal sacrifice is sometimes necessary for social change. However, despite the commercialization of her legend and its transformation into a more romanticized image, the core message of Lady Godiva's story remains unchanged. The struggle for justice often requires bold, radical acts, even at great personal cost. Whether viewed as a feminist icon, a symbol of personal sacrifice, or a figure of defiance against oppressive systems, Lady Godiva's legacy transcends her time. Her story is not just one of a woman who rode naked through the streets of Coventry. It is a story of courage, resilience, and the power of one individual to challenge the status quo and inspire others to do the same. As we look back on the legend of Lady Godiva, it's clear that her story has transcended its original context to become something far more universal. No longer just the tale of a noblewoman's defiance against oppressive taxes, Godiva's legacy has grown into a symbol of the fight for justice, the struggle for gender equality, and the power of sacrifice for a greater cause. Over time, Her story has been reshaped, reinterpreted, and often commercialized, but the core of her actions remains a powerful reminder of the potential for change through individual courage. One of the most enduring aspects of Godiva's legacy is her transformation from a historical figure into an icon of resistance. Her ride through Coventry, which was initially an act of desperation to alleviate the suffering of the common people, became a metaphor for defiance against the status quo. In many ways, Godiva's story speaks to the universal human desire for justice, for a world where the powerful do not simply use their strength to oppress others. Her act of standing alone, publicly exposed, was a direct challenge to the entrenched power structures of her time, and that challenge has resonated across generations. Over time, the myth of Lady Godiva began to overshadow the historical details of her ride. She was no longer seen simply as a noblewoman protesting her husband's policies, but became an enduring symbol of both female empowerment and resistance to the injustices of power. As her story passed through the hands of artists, writers, and filmmakers, she evolved from a historical figure into an archetype, one that would inspire countless stories of personal sacrifice and rebellion. Her courage in the face of public humiliation, her willingness to expose herself for the sake of the common people, became a model of how one person's action can ripple through society and spark change. This evolution of her image, though sometimes romanticized and distorted, does not erase the original, powerful message of her ride. Lady Godiva's decision to risk everything for the sake of justice was an act of extraordinary bravery. Her vulnerability was her strength. She showed that to challenge a system as entrenched as the feudal order, one must be willing to give up more than just material wealth. One must be willing to risk their very reputation, their standing in society, and even their safety. It was a message that resounded not just with the people of her time, but with every generation that came after her. In modern times, Godiva's legacy has been reclaimed by the feminist movements that recognize her as an early symbol of women fighting for autonomy and power in a world that sought to silence them. Her willingness to challenge her husband, to risk the scorn of the aristocracy and even her own family, was a rare act of female agency in a period where women were expected to be seen and not heard. Today, her image is embraced by those who fight for gender equality, as she represents the courage it takes to defy the systems that oppress and marginalize. Her story continues to be told in various forms, in art, in literature, in films, and even in advertisements, though often stripped of its political meaning. In some ways, the commercialized versions of her image detract from her original purpose, her bold and dangerous act of political defiance, but they also show the enduring power of her name. Godiva has become a universal symbol, one that continues to capture the imagination of people across cultures and contexts, whether as a figure of sacrifice, sensuality, or strength. But for those who look deeper, the true Godiva remains a symbol of resistance and courage. Her story reminds us that power structures are not unbreakable, that even those who seem the most powerless can find ways to challenge and reshape their world. Her act of defiance was not just about lowering taxes or alleviating the suffering of the people. It was about confronting the very systems that perpetuated inequality and injustice. It was an act of solidarity with those who had no voice, a call for the powerful to acknowledge the needs of the powerless. And that is why her legacy endures. In the 21st century, Godiva's story still holds significant relevance. Her courage to challenge the established power of her time continues to inspire those who seek to create a more just and equal world. Whether it's through movements for women's rights, workers' rights, or social justice, Godiva's spirit of resistance lives on. She is a reminder that true change often requires sacrifice, that in the fight for justice, one must sometimes expose the most vulnerable parts of themselves to make a lasting impact. Ultimately, Lady Godiva's legacy is a reminder of what is possible when one person, driven by a sense of justice and compassion, stands up to the forces that seek to oppress others. Her ride through the streets of Coventry is not just a tale of a historical moment, but a timeless lesson in courage, sacrifice, and the power of individual action. It teaches us that, no matter the odds, one person's act of defiance can ripple through history and leave an indelible mark on the world. Lady Godiva may have lived in the 11th century, but her message, her commitment to justice, equality, and compassion continues to resonate today. In a world where the fight for human rights and social justice is still ongoing, Godiva's legacy serves as both a beacon of hope and a call to action. She stands as a testament to the power of one individual's courage to create change, and her story will continue to inspire generations to come. And there you have it, the incredible, timeless story of Lady Godiva, a woman who dared to defy the odds and stand up for what she believed in, even when it meant sacrificing everything. From her legendary ride through the streets of Coventry to becoming a symbol of courage and justice, Godiva's story is more than just a tale of medieval history. It's a reminder that one person can change the world, challenge the powerful, and make a lasting impact on society. Her bravery wasn't just about the act of riding through the streets. It was about standing for what was right, even when it was the hardest thing to do. Lady Godiva's journey speaks to us today, reminding us that courage comes in many forms, and sometimes change begins with the most unexpected of actions. Whether you're fighting for justice, equality, or simply standing up for what's right in your own life, Godiva's example is a call to action for all of us. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Lady Godiva's life and legacy, make sure to hit that like button to show your support for more content like this. And don't keep this powerful story to yourself. Share this video with your friends, family, or anyone who could use a little inspiration. Who knows? Maybe her courage will spark a change in someone's life today. And hey, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. We've got plenty more incredible stories coming your way, from legendary figures to untold histories. Every subscription helps us bring more of these fascinating tales to life, and it ensures you won't miss out on any of our future videos. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of Lady Godiva's story? How do you think her legacy applies to the world we live in today? Let us know what inspires you most about her act of defiance, and don't forget to join the conversation. Your insights could be the spark for someone else to make a bold move in their own life. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this journey with us. We can't wait to share more stories of bravery, sacrifice, and humanity in the videos to come. Remember, change doesn't always come from the top. It can start with a single, brave step. Until next time, take care and stay inspired.